The 8 article by Collier and Hoeffler was one of the earliest and most influential statements of the economic causes of Civil War argument. Their main point was that Civil War has economic causes. Um, and wars break out when the benefits of going to war exceed the costs of doing so. Grievances are universal, but wars are not, which means that grievances as an explanation of war is incomplete. The cost of conflict, what goes into that calculation? Clearly, going to war requires quitting your day job in most cases. And so fighting takes you away from the opportunity of earning that money or getting any benefit from doing that job. It also economically interrupts activity. So if you have an ongoing war in an area, people are less likely to invest in that area or be able to work in that job and produce economically. Therefore, wealthier countries have more to lose because they have more economic activity, right? And so, therefore, the longer these wars last, the more costly they're likely to be because of the time, the opportunity cost of the time being taken away from overall economic production. The benefits of conflict, the incentives for participating are contingent upon whether your side actually wins. The rewards for winning, in part, are determined by how large the government's pile of money to redistribute is, in other words, what's the tax base of the country, or the corporations or the people within that country that you would control and be able to govern. This tax base also determines how strong a state is when it's fighting potential rebels. War costs money on both sides, and the state also needs funds to be able to fight the war. So the costs and benefits of conflict, you put those together, and in Collier and Hoeffler, they have this rebel utility formula in which there is this abstract decision making by a person who potentially might be able to fight, and you would have this rather scary looking formula. But I want to try to take a moment with this formula and try to show how these things are actually great simplifications for understanding what arguments authors are actually making. So, how many of you in your reading actually spent time to go through this formula? I'm willing to bet maybe a few hardy souls, but most probably would glaze over those once you are actually seeing numbers and letters and Greek symbols and things. And when I first started reading these kind of approaches, my eyes used to cross over as well. And it took some time to be able to appreciate the usefulness of having these kind of models in papers because it helps clarify what the main factors go into an explanatory model, what is being left out, and it forces an author to be transparent and concise in explaining their causal argument, which I think is relevant. So it might be actually easier to just break it up and to go through each one of these factors individually. The benefits of the conflict are a function of the probability of winning, P times the gains from actually winning. And these gains from winning are determined by the size of the population and the taxable capacity of the economy. So the larger the population, the more the taxable capacity of the state, the higher the benefits of winning. Those gains are shaped by the denominator, which is the expected duration of the war and people's discount rate, how much people value gains today versus gains sometime in the future. The costs for fighting, in turn, is determined by the rebels' current income that they would give up if they decided to fight, and the cost of coordinating with other potential rebels. Sometimes One of the more difficult things, especially in states with high capacity, is being able to coordinate in ways that the state can't stop you from moving to the next stage ahead of time. These costs of conflict are also shaped by the expected duration of the war. The longer it is, the more costly it would likely to be, because the longer you're away from your jobs and your loved ones. Putting the costs and the benefits together, if the potential costs are smaller than the potential benefits, the more likely you are to see an outbreak of conflict. And this is just a simple equation in which you have these kind of costs and benefits of this kind of economic decision making that economists often assume the ideal kind of decision maker would do before they actually do things. The benefit of this kind of approach is this is an incredibly general argument, and so it should theoretically apply in a whole bunch of different contexts, because there's not many other assumptions about these decisions besides these a few probability of victory, population size, the taxable capacity, those kind of things. And so the difficulty, I think, in trying to move on from this kind of generalized statement is be able to apply it to specific cases, or be able to try to come up with proxies for these quite general costs and benefits. So what do Collier and Hoeffler use for their proxies? For benefits, the probability of winning is shaped by the taxable capacity of the state, how much a state can extract taxes from their citizens. Different countries will have different actual taxable capacities. You see during the last economic crisis of 2008, 2009, Greece and Turkey really struggled to be able to continue to collect taxes to be able to have enough money to pay all their obligations, while you have other countries that have the United States is actually surprisingly has a higher taxable capacity, given the limited amount of the IRS's capacity to enforce it. A lot of people do pay their taxes voluntarily. So taxable capacity, and they proxy that with per capita income, which shapes government's military expenditures. The larger the economy, all else equal, the more the military should have to be able to spend as a percentage. And then the natural resource endowment, which is the percentage of primary commodities as the size of the overall economy. Next, the gains are conditional upon victory. You won't actually get a lot of the benefits until you actually take over the country. How do you proxy that? The size of the population and the per capita of the income as a reward to distribute and keep. So hopefully you'll notice it's interesting that the per capita income here is doing double duty, both shaping government expenditures as well as the overall size of the reward to distribute to yourselves if you participate and win. What are the empirical proxies for the costs? The transaction costs of coordinating, how much time, effort, or risk is involved with actually coordinating and organizing a group, because it's quite difficult. In one of my earlier classes, I tried to teach my students all this different steps to be able to organize one, tried to hypothetically be able to organize one just to show how difficult it is to try to find that method, the means, motive, and opportunity to be able to act. So those costs of coordinating, Collier and Hoeffler, they use the proxies of cultural distinctness. Ethnic linguistic fractionalization is their proxy for that. In countries that have 2 or 3 clear ethnic groups, it's likely, at least in recent history, that one group is more likely to be in power and one out of power. So if you have clearly delineated groups, it should be easier to be able to organize than ones in which everyone is either of their own ethnic group or if they're all homogenous. Size of the population also affect the transaction cost. The larger the population size, the easier it should be to be able to find somebody that shares your motives for fighting. What are the opportunity costs for fighting proxies? Per capita income. is the main one, which again, per capita income comes in a couple of different ways. There have been a lot of attention and articles given to this work. They've had to follow on in the 5 year or so years after it with a number of other work clarifying their expectations, their findings, and the cases in which they actually apply to it. A couple of main critiques that I've seen is they too quickly dismiss grievances. Their argument is all about greed, and arguably greed should be as ubiquitous as grievances, right? But you don't see it everywhere, so it's only in places in which you can actually act, where you have the institutional opportunities or the geographical opportunities. We're going to get more into those later. Another critique is they use a cross-sectional model. They don't look at the probability of conflict over time. If you have a poor country and there's not conflict all the time, why is it more likely to trigger at one time as opposed to another? They only look at a snapshot in time, so you can't really see how, as one of your factors like income changes, the probability of conflict changes. And another critique is that they have a very different argument than the major other article I didn't have you read that's in the recommended reading by James Fearon and David Layton in 2003. They came out with a piece that uses GDP as a proxy for state capacity. So for Collier and Hoeffler, it's more about the costs and benefits of participating, and largely the size of the prize GDP is proxying for, while Fearon and Layton, GDP is a proxy for state capacity for the government to be able to provide goods for their citizens or to be able to clamp down on opposition. They, as I mentioned before, have multiple theoretical uses for two indicators, which are some of the few that are widely observed in a number of different countries, which is probably why they're so popular in statistical models, GDP and population. However, it muddles the theoretical story if you're using the same factor for a couple of different elements of that cost-benefit model. Another kind of technical issue that I had with it is they include variables in a linear fashion instead of controlling for outliers by logging. And so if you have something like GDP, if you have Liechtenstein or the US or Brunei that has a high per capita income, if you have peace or war in those countries, they're going to have a much larger effect on the relationship between GDP and conflict than if you try to control for those outliers to give the other countries as much of a weight. They also don't really theoretically differentiate that much between onset and duration of conflict, and that in the years since there's been work showing that the initial start of conflict is driven by different factors that determine how long a conflict actually lasts. I mean, most obviously, it would be interventions by major powers. You think of Syria. Bashar al-Assad wouldn't have been able to survive as long as he had if it hadn't been for the external support of Russia. And so I use this initial approach by Collier and Hoeffler to get you to be familiar with the cost-benefit analysis of going to conflict that we're going to see later on in the semester, as well as the difficulty in linking theory and the cases and evidence there that you actually use. Something that you're going to have to struggle with in your papers. I struggle with in my own research. Political science is an incredibly young field. Economics is a bit older, though they've recently veered more into political science's lane when looking at conflict. Paul Collier and Anke Hoeffler are still active in looking at political phenomena, including democracy, elections. Related to conflict, he was influential in heading this working group within the World Bank. They came out with a book in 2003 called Breaking the Conflict Trap that helped really tie these kind of quantitative models to general policymaking impacts. That was influential in shaping policymakers' understanding of the drivers of conflict And if greed was the prime motivator, then you have to be able to address those in different policy ways than if you think that conflict is driven by grievances. So it's still incomplete, and it hopefully highlights the inherent trade-offs involved in all of these kind of research. For me, I'm interested in getting your feedback on this material so far. We've covered a lot of theoretical and empirical ground already. My question, if you can answer in Waddle, is do you find greed an intuitive explanation for conflict? Why or why not? Right? Is this kind of greed approach that Collier and Hoeffler adopts, does it speak to you, or is it missing something that you think is important? Please answer in Waddle under week 2, lecture question 1. Some of these questions that are multiple choice, this one isn't, I have to assign grades to because it's a Waddle quiz, but they don't have any meaning. I will have separate participation entries in Waddle that reflects my understanding of your answer. Now, once you've done with that, let's take a break. And I put a brief video of Paul Collier from YouTube discussing his causes of conflict. He has a bunch of other lectures and stuff online. This one I thought gives you a short view of his take about the overall decline of violence worldwide.